Hello, and welcome to this talk for Leaping Hare 2020 entitled Too Young to Die, which is a journey through understandings of apotheosis, which might well lead to the question as to quite what is apotheosis in the first place. It's a word that has a number of meanings, but the particular meaning that I'm referring to here is a theological process in which a mortal, usually human, but not always, is lifted up to the status of being a divine or semi-divine figure, so that they become a god or a demigod or something equivalent to that. Usually it happens after death, but again, not always. There are occasions where people are apotheosized during their own lifetime. Now, this is a phenomenon that happens in a number of different religions. There are some religions in which it is considered blasphemous to do it. Islam, for example, considers apotheosis a blasphemous notion, but many other religions, both ones in the current world and ones in the ancient world, have had some form of apotheosis as part of their spiritual understanding. So I want to look at some of the historical background to that and go on to think about what that might mean for us as 21st century pagans, how we can, from our various different traditions of heathens and Wiccans and Druids and Chemetics and Hellenics and what have you, how we can understand the concepts of apotheosis, both in terms of insights it may give us into the nature of the universe, and also some potential problems that some of us, like me, for example, have in adjusting to the notion of apotheosis. And along the way we'll look at Carl Jung's ideas, hence the title, who didn't speak in immense depth about the notion of apotheosis. He understood it in a slightly different context to the theological explanation I've just given. So we'll touch on his understanding of the term and how that can relate to self-awareness, to understanding one's own life and development and spiritual awakening, and explore that way. Now, I'm going to look at three particular figures as we go along. On the left-hand side of the slide is a bust of Antinous, who in life was the lover of the Emperor Hadrian. Well, one of, quite a few lovers, but Antinous had a huge influence in the life of Hadrian. He fell hook, line and sinker in love with young Antinous, who was a teenager. It's a little bit sordid because Hadrian was a middle-aged man at the time, but that was the social mores and customs of the day. And eventually Antinous died under somewhat ambiguous circumstances whilst travelling in Egypt. He was on a boat travelling down the Nile, and no one's quite sure whether he was pushed off, whether he committed suicide and jumped off, whether it was an accident, could have been drunk and fallen off the boat, or it could have been murder. No one is actually sure, but however it happened, he ended up headfirst in the Nile and drowned. And there was an Egyptian custom of the day, and we might well say for Egyptian pagans still the custom of the modern day, but certainly a very prevalently held view in the ancient world, that anyone who drowned in the Nile was partaking in the mysteries of the green-skinned god, the ones that the Greeks called Osiris, although he was known to the Egyptians by a number of different names, one of which the name I tend to use personally in ritual was Azur. Osiris, or Azur's story, involves him being sealed into a sarcophagus by his own brother, and with the aid of some servants the sarcophagus is cast into the Nile, and either he suffocates from lack of oxygen or he drowns in the Nile. It's not entirely clear, but he dies as part of this process of being thrown into the Nile. And so anyone, whether they were peasant or wealthy aristocrat who met their end in the waters of the Nile, was seen as participating in that mystery of the dying and resurrected god, and acquiring a rather magical status in the process. In the months following the death of Antinous, a number of people, some in Egypt, some in other parts of the world around the Roman Empire, reported having visions of Antinous talking to them in sort of dreamlike visionary states, and word reached Hadrian Now, there's no particular suggestion that Hadrian himself had one of these visions, but he was so impressed by the quality of the visions other people were reporting to him and the stories he'd heard from Egypt about the fate of people who drowned in the Nile, that in the depth of his grief and his attachment to Antinous was very, very deep. He died, Antinous, when he was about 19, 20 years old. So he sort of this vision of perfection in the mind of the Emperor Hadrian. So deep was his grief that he came to share the Egyptian view that Antinous had partaken of these religious mysteries and had risen from the dead, become a demigod, a divine figure. And so he had temples built to Antinous as a god around the Roman Empire. An entire city, Antinopolis, was dedicated to Antinous in Egypt. There's very little left of it nowadays except a bit of rubble in the desert. But at one stage it was a very big, thriving city with a very large temple to its patron deity. Where I live in Suffolk, just up the road in a village called Capel St Mary, not just a few miles away from where I live, archaeologists found a little bust, tiny little, of Antinous. It's now sitting in the Ipswich Museum. Whether that was being a tiny thing, it may well have been in a traveller's portable shrine. So there wasn't necessarily a temple to Antinous in what is now called Capel St Mary, but there was at least someone staying there, passing through, who brought the devotion to this apotheosized deity with them. Now, in a similar tale, the figure in the middle is a Chinese Taoist deity of fairly late origin. So whilst the story of Antinous goes back, well, approaching 2,000 years, the best part of 2,000 years anyway, the story of Tua Shen, the figure in the middle, goes back to the 17th century, so a much more recent apotheosis. And the tale goes that a young Chinese warrior by the name of Hu Champao had fallen in love with an imperial inspector who was very aristocratic of birth, and the imperial inspector was doing the rounds inspecting, and this soldier had seen him from afar. He'd, no doubt, perhaps served in his bodyguard or something like that, and had fallen deeply in love with him. At one juncture, desperate to have some kind of contact, if we can call it that, with his beloved, Hu Chanbao waited until the imperial inspector was in the bathhouse having a wash, and he drilled a little hole in the side of the wall so he could spy through and watch the man of his dreams getting naked and having a bath. And he must have made a noise or something, because the imperial inspector realised that he was there and summoned his guards, who stormed outside the building, found the soldier crouching, peering through the hole in the wall, and the imperial inspector, presumably having put on a towel or something, bathrobe or whatever, came out of the bathhouse, demanded to know what was going on, and Hu Chanbao confessed that he had fallen in love with this inspector. And the inspector was so outraged, not, it has to be said, because this was one man falling in love with another man, that particular hostility, if you like, that prejudice towards such things is a more recent phenomenon. But the inspector's objection was that this low-class, humble-born nobody had presumed to lust after a high-born aristocrat. Had it been somebody of a similar social status, that would have been a different issue. But because this was a peasant, really, lusting after someone above his station, he ordered Hu Chanbao to be beaten to death on the spot by the bodyguards, who promptly did. And so he lay on the floor bleeding his life essence out. And the soul of Hu Chanbao descended into the underworld to be judged by Yama, the god of the dead, in Taoist religion. And as was always the case, each soul arriving in the underworld had to explain to the judge of the dead what had happened to them, how they had come to be dead in the first place. And on hearing this story, the judge said, well, you cannot come into hell because you have died for love. It's only the wicked who come into hell, and there is nothing wicked in dying for love. You must go up to the heavens, you must go to stand before the august Jade Emperor himself. And so the soul was sent on up and stood before the Emperor and recounted the same tale, and the King of the Gods, the Emperor, I should say Emperor of the Gods really, shouldn't I? He decided that such was the tragedy of this young man's life that he would make him into a god. So he translated Hu Chan Bao into a deity, and because of that translation he acquired a new name, and the new name was Tu Ashen, which means the little rabbit god, hence the ears on the statue. They're meant to be rabbit ears. People in the Fujian province where Hu Chan Bao lived and died began to have visions and dreams that the little rabbit god was talking to them. And as a result of these visions and dreams being discussed and reported and doing the rounds, as it were, temples and shrines to Hashem began to spring up around that part of China and remained in place for quite a few hundred years. Various, as time went by and European missionaries became a presence in China, there were missionaries commenting on it, there were Chinese scribes commenting as well, not just missionaries but scribes commenting on the presence of these temples. And after the passage of a couple of centuries, the notion of two men being in love, or at least one man being in love with another man, even if it wasn't reciprocated on this occasion, had fallen out of favour, and so it became discussed as a topic of shock, even amongst the Chinese a couple of centuries later, not simply amongst the Western missionaries who were shocked by such things. And efforts were then made, perhaps as a result of wanting to curry favour with the West, to dismantle the temples and shrines around Fujian province and tear down the statues. Even in that day and age, these were places where men who had fallen in love with other men would go to pray and make offerings to Tu Hashen and ask for his help in bringing love and romance into their life. The cult fell out of favour, but has been restarted by modern day Chinese people. There's temples to Hashen in Taiwan, amongst the Chinese expatriate community, and online temples to him, and temples to him in America, and I'm sure other parts of the world as well. So his worship has been revived. The figure on the far right of the screen is the Spartan prince Hyacinthus, from which we get the modern day word hyacinth, the name of the flower. Hyacinthus was a warrior. If you've seen that film, The 300, or read the comic book on which it's based, the Spartans were a roughy-tufty bunch, to put it mildly. Very, very fierce warriors, and Hyacinthus was a warrior prince. You may see some late Victorian Edwardian paintings depicting Hyacinthus, and that they always seem to be of really rather prepubescent, icky images, which probably speak to the sexual appetites of the painters rather than anything else. But the myth talks of him being a warrior prince, so a much more macho image than some of those late artworks allow for. He was the love object of Apollo, who fell madly, deeply in love with Prince Hyacinthus, and courted him and wooed him and charmed him, and they were together as a human divine couple for a fair period of time. But Apollo wasn't the only one to lust after him. There was also Zephyrus, the god of the west wind. And whereas Apollo is bright and radiant and beautiful and stunning and brilliant, Zephyrus is gentle and whispering and shy west wind, or at least the west wind in Greece is a shy wind, and could never quite make an impression, never quite get noticed by Hyacinthus, who had eyes only for Apollo. Zephyrus grew more and more and more jealous until eventually the love triangle became a murderous love triangle. And one day when Apollo and Hyacinthus were playing with the discus, which, if you're unfamiliar, is like a very heavy-duty frisbee, Zephyrus, out of sheer spite of what the Romans called invidia, that if I can't have something, nobody else will have it either, blew a gust up and caused the discus, which was quite a heavy thing, to go off course. And just as Hyacinthus was leaping up to grab it out of the sky, it veered off course and smashed into his head so hard it killed him, and he fell dead on the earth. And Apollo was just overwhelmed with grief, and the tradition has it that as the blood leached from the wound in Hyacinthus's head, from the blood splatters on the grass grew flowers, which were the Hyacinthus flowers. It was assumed for a long while that Hyacinthus and modern-day hyacinth were one and the same thing, but some botanists think it might have been the larkspur was perhaps originally understood by a different name to the name we give it these days, but that's a botanical quibble. The point here being that as Hyacinthus lay dying, Apollo, determined not to be robbed of his beloved, lifted him up to a divine status and translated him into a demigod who was worshipped throughout Sparta and seen as this very, very significant figure with his own 3-day festival of his death, a day of his death and mourning, a day of his entombment, and a day of his rebirth. So another dying and rising god. That took place in July, but no one is quite sure when in July because specific dates aren't given to hammer it out. But the Hyacinthia was a very big, important festival, and they would even, the warriors of Sparta, if war was raging, and it almost always was with the Spartans because they were quite a military bunch, they would put the war on the hold so they could all go home for the 3 days of the Hyacinthia. And then when that was over and done with, they'd go back to kicking 7 shades out of people, which gives you an idea of how significant that festival was. Now, if you're wondering whether all forms of apotheosis involve pretty young men, the answer is no. I'm just including them because I can, and why not? There are stories involving women, there are stories involving straight men, so you get all genders, sexualities, etc. contained within the tradition of apotheosis. So it's not just nice young men being lifted up to a divine status, it's other figures as well. But the key here in all 3 of these stories is that once upon a time they were all mortal, and it was at their death that they became immortal, they became something extra, something magical, through various means and methods. We'll come back to elements of their story as we go along, but this is more to kind of illustrate the idea. So in terms of how they attain divinity, how they attain their wondrous status, some it's through the process of visions and portents of the living, having dreams, having visions, having mystical experiences of this newly deified figure, and then telling other living people about it, and those people being so impressed by what they heard that they go out and they build shrines and temples and what have you to them, and a new deity comes into the pantheon. So you've already got Tua Shen as an example of that. Miao Shan is one of the names given to the goddess Kuan Yin, who started off as a male figure in India, but by the time Kuan Yin arrived in China, he became she, and a backstory was created. And often there is a query with a lot of figures in Chinese Buddhism and Chinese Taoism which have a heavy overlap with each other in terms of folk practice. A principal teaching of Taoism is that all of the gods were once people, humans, mortals, walking the earth, but who did such wondrous things that at death they became something more, something amazing, something magical. And so a tale is given of a princess who at death became Liao Shan, as she's known in one part of China, or Kuan Yin as she's known in other parts of China. So that kind of a mystical revelation to the living. We can argue politics and power play a strong role for a lot of figures. the various pharaohs of Egypt, when they were alive, were identified with Hare or Horus, the divine pharaoh. And when those pharaohs died, they became identified with the father of Hare or Horus, with Osiris or Azur. And one of the phrases used, which you can perhaps deploy to win a game of Scrabble hands down, is Osirification, the process of being identified with Osiris. So whether they were good pharaohs or bad pharaohs or completely indifferent pharaohs, because of their political status, they attained godhood. A form of godhood in life and a different form of godhood in death. Quirinus is the divine form of Remus. So Romulus and Remus both became deities after their death, and each of them was lifted up to sort of a divine magical status as founding deities of Rome. So both became these godlike figures, partly wholly maybe, because of their political status. Asclepius, the Greek god of medicine, was said to have been a human doctor once upon a time, whose skill with medicine was so amazing that at his death Zeus lifted him up to the heavens, made him part of the constellations, because he was so deeply impressed with the knowledge that Asclepius had. There are tales told of also Jung, as a Chinese, one of the 8 immortal sages, who was again a healer, a physician, someone possessed of immense knowledge. That such was the depth of his knowledge, as was the other 7 of the immortals, that at death Zhang and the others became something greater, something more wondrous. There are figures like Heracles and Atalanta, whose divinity rested in part on their great heroism in life, their phenomenal achievements, like Atalanta being the greatest huntress of Greece, and Heracles being a great warrior hero who performed the 12 impossible labours. In a similar vein, Chiron, the centaur, was an example of someone who was never human in the first place, but who was seen as a mortal figure, and the maiden Psyche, who was once mortal, both of whom, because of their devotion, their commitment, the services they gave in life, became divine figures after death. So sometimes it's more of a declaration made by humans who have had these dreams and visions and revelations, and sometimes it's seen as more the agency of a pre-existing god who lifts the recently dead up to join them in godlike status as demigods and deities. Now, where we branch into a Jungian element, and I'll try not to bog you down with too much Jungian psychology here, but Carl Jung was enormously influenced by alchemy, by the tarot, by astrology, by the study of dreams, by all sorts of religious and metaphysical systems, which he felt was humanity's attempt from different cultures, different parts of the world, to understand the depths of the both individual unconsciousness and the collective unconsciousness that we all share, that each and every one of us alive on the planet at the moment, along with every single person who has ever lived and died in the past, have participated in a collective mind space, this sort of dream-like state where our minds merge in contact with each other. Our experiences that we have in life inform the collective unconscious, and we in turn are informed by it. Those of you who have heard me witter on about Jung in the past will be familiar with this particular visual image, but for those of you who haven't, the study of the teachings of Sigmund Freud, who was Carl Jung's mentor for many years, often used the image of an iceberg to show that the waking mind is the small tip of the iceberg. It may look big, but it's actually only a small fraction, and the vast majority of the iceberg is underwater, which is the unconscious mind. That was Freud's argument, that whatever part our conscious minds have, there's a much, much bigger part of us, unseen beneath the surface, this dreaming self. I want to expand this image and add to it and ask you to visualize the frozen waters of the Arctic, or indeed the Antarctic for that matter, with icebergs floating in the water. And there could be a dozen icebergs floating in the water. Each iceberg is a person. The water, the ocean, is the collective unconscious. Now the icebergs look like distinct separate things. You can look at a dozen different icebergs. You could name them if you feel like it. You can see them floating as individual entities in the water, but they're all made out of water. They are just water in a solidified state, in a frozen state. And throughout the lifetime of an iceberg, bits of it will break off, it will melt as the weather changes, and not just talking about global warming, but just in the normal run thing, the weather changes. Bits of the iceberg break, drop off, go into the oceans and dissolve and become part of the oceans. In the same way that our experiences, our dreams, our hopes, our fears, our loves, our hates go from us into the collective unconscious. But also, more water will freeze and add to the iceberg. So as one bit breaks off, another bit is being added on. As the water slopping around the iceberg freezes and solidifies as the weather gets colder and colder, and becomes part of the iceberg. So just as bits of us drop off, so other bits are added as we absorb from the collective unconscious, and we grow and we change and we develop in that process. And more than that, if there's a dozen icebergs floating in that patch of ocean, those icebergs are feeding into and out of each other. So it's not just the collective unconscious in some abstract manner. The bits of the iceberg that break off and dissolve, those water molecules will become part of the other icebergs that are floating there. And so bits of us become parts of other people. Ideas and feelings and emotions go from us to become part of other people. They hear our ideas. You're hearing ideas now that I'm spouting. These ideas were once ideas put out by Carl Jung. He got those ideas from other people, who got them from other people, got them from other people. And so ideas go from one mind to another mind to another mind to another mind. And it's not just ideas, it's emotions, beliefs, convictions, fears, hopes, love, terror. The whole panoply of human experience goes from one human to another to another to another. You can look at a crowd of people in the way in which an emotion will ripple around that crowd. Whether it's an ecstatic pop concert crowd chucking their knickers at the band on the stage, or whether it's a riot that starts with a little flare-up of violence in one corner and then all of a sudden the whole bunch of them are rioting and it spreads across. Emotions spread through the crowd. We have this sort of telepathic interconnection. That's something Jung was very keen on understanding and describing. Jung himself, as far as anybody knows, was not pagan, although he had a strong, deep interest in pagan mythologies. But as far as we know, he didn't actually sign up to paganism and identify himself as a pagan. Where I'd add to his ideas, and this is just my own personal weirdness, not something that Jung himself was promoting, is that it's not simply humans that participate in the collective unconscious. All living beings that are capable of sapience participate in a colossal unconsciousness. Dogs and cats and horses, and I doubt as a pagan, and perhaps many of you will share this experience and point of view, that plant life has consciousness, that rocks and rivers and forests as collective phenomena have consciousness. And not only do they have their own individualized consciousness as contained entities, like icebergs floating in an ocean have their own individual identity, but they melt into and are added to from that great vast oceanic pool. So not only are we transmitting human to human, but between human and other species, which I think is an element of what we often describe as totemism, when we are encountering the consciousness of other species. And encounters with deities, an encounter with the consciousness of a mountain a mountain which could be millions of years old and continue to last for millions of more years. That mountain may feel godlike. So the Greeks refer to Molas as the god of the mountains, the consciousness of the mountains. And why not? To all practical intents and purposes, it may as well be a god. Whether it is or not in some very abstract theological sense, I think is kind of a bit of a moot point. But we have these encounters with these profound consciousnesses. Back to the plot of the Quaternity. Jung loved the number 4. He saw a lot of things in sets of 4. Part of this was inspired by Western notions of astrology, which have signs in sets of 4 elements, as an idea that goes back to ancient Greece. It's a Greek take on astrology. So Chinese astrology, for example, has 5 elements rather than 4 elements, but Jung was initially mainly familiar with Western astrology. Goes back to Empedocles and earth, air, fire and water. Goes back to a number of ideas. Heraclitus spoke in similar veins and wrote about similar things. The medieval alchemists, and then the later bodies of ceremonial magicians, who combined elements of paganism with elements of Christianity and elements of Judaism and elements of Islam, and so bringing the mystical traditions of a number of different religious systems together, spoke in terms of a process of 4 stages. The ones you've got on the slide here are 4 alchemical stages. Now, the books of alchemy talk about turning lead into gold, for example, which many people took quite literally, that you could get a block of lead and do various things to it, and one day it would turn into a block of gold. Jung was of the opinion, and not just him, other people have shared Jung's opinion, that that is a misunderstanding. It's taking things too literally. That rather what the alchemists of the medieval period, most of them at least, were talking about was not turning a lump of lead into a lump of gold, but rather taking a very undeveloped human mind, putting it through a spiritual process, and the gold at the end is spiritual awakening. It's becoming that enlightened being at the end of it. And this is not a kind of money-making expedition to turn cheap old lead into super expensive gold. This is a spiritual process, and that's certainly how Jung wrote about it in that context. Sometimes he uses the Latin terms, and sometimes he uses the Greek terms, so I've included both in the top line of the table on the slide. So just briefly to go over them, and I could talk about this for hours, but clearly I won't because of the time slot. Nigredo, which is the Latin for blackening, or melanosis, which is the same thing, is the early stages. But there's a whole process you get to before you even get to that stage. So it's not Nigredo is not the kind of dozy and enlightened human being. It's someone who's already got to a certain point already. They've been through a hell of a lot before they can even achieve the Nigredo stage. But it's a particular juncture, an encounter with darkness, and the alchemists in Jung associated it with the element of earth and the direction of north. He speaks about encountering the shadow, which is an idea developed from Freud that he massively expanded on Freud's early notion. The shadow is the dark side of ourselves, and going back to ancient Greek religion and mythology, there are 2 presences which each individual has, the Cacodemon and the Agathodaemon. The Cacodemon, we'll talk about it in a moment, the other one in a few minutes, is a daemon is a spirit. It's the origin of the word demon, but whereas Christianity has taken demon to mean horns and fangs and eating babies and scary, scary stuff, in the Greek context, demon is a neutral term. It's not good or bad, it just means a spirit, a particular type of guardian spirit. A cacodemon is the guardian of darkness, of wickedness, of cruelty, of an accounting. You could almost compare it to the Jewish notion of Samael as the angel who eventually gets labelled as Satan in the Christian tradition. But from a more Jewish perspective, Samael is appointed by God to keep track of everyone's naughty deeds. And so come the day when you peg it and you go for your evaluation, there is an angel who accounts all of the good things you have done, and another angel, Samael, who accounts all the rotten things you have done. And you are weighed in the balance. An idea very similar to Egyptian notions of the soul of the recently dead being weighed on the scales against the feather of Ma'at, to compare all of the wicked things you've done, which you have to confess to the 42 assessors of the dead, and all of the good things that you've done. So there's a kind of a weighing up process in Egyptian understanding as well. But the kakodaemon is like the Freudian notion of the shadow, and where Jung expands it, the Freudian notions, is to say it's a combination of all your darker, more brutal, more cruel things, the nasty, spiteful, vindictive, shitty, dishonest things you've done in life, and all of the impulses that you still have floating around within yourself to do more of that kind of stuff in the future. But it also includes elements of yourself that you have been taught to be ashamed of, which are not necessarily de facto shameful. It's simply in your culture, in your family, in your background, for whatever reasons, you've been taught to keep certain bits of yourself hidden in the dark and not show them to other people. And that will vary enormously according to culture. So it can include quite nasty things like sadism and cruelty, but it can also include sexual desire, if you've been taught that sex is dirty. It can include emotional vulnerability, if you've been taught that that is weak and pathetic and shameful and has to be hidden. It can include grief, unexpressed, unarticulated grief, which Freud felt was at the root of clinical depression, that the inability to articulate your grief and your loss becomes caustic and eats away at the soul. It can include being artistic if you come from a family that thinks art is rubbish and pathetic and useless. It could include being clever if you come from a family that think book learning is for ponces and is something you should keep quiet about. It can include a whole raft of things that's in the dark. The phase of nigredo or melanosis is something that all people ultimately, if they live long enough at least, will go through as they move towards spiritual awakening, and something which those beings who go through apotheosis in the stories encounter and go through, because it's a descent into the underworld. In a Christian and Islamic context, you might talk about the journey into hell and facing the terrors of hell. But within various pagan contexts, many pagan myths have the notion of an underworld, a dark, frightening place of unhappy ghosts and tormented spirits and vengeful, vindictive entities. So in Sumerian myth, Inanna has to journey into the dark underworld in order to rescue the soul of her beloved who's died, and she must confront her own sister, Rishkigo, who is a very wild, bitter, vindictive, violent, destructive presence who lashes out and claws at anyone who gets too close, including her own sister. So it's a confronting, and where Jung wanted to put a huge emphasis is that whilst it can play out in daily life as confronting frightening, horrible, nasty, scary people who've done crappy things to you, or people you're scared of in some other capacity, and having to confront them, what ultimately it really boils down to is confronting the darkness inside, a descent into your own private hell and misery and pain and suffering and darkness, your own capacity for wickedness, your own capacity for misery and unarticulated pain and grief. And it's that suffering that is the first stage, the burning away of, which is what's called blackening, the idea of burning something so it becomes charcoal, the burning away of unwanted elements within yourself. And so like Hu Chanbao being battered to death on the orders of the man who loves, who probably stands there and laughs his socks off at me as he watches. It's that rage and bitterness and pain and suffering and death like Antinous drowning in the Nile, the waters flooding into his lungs, losing consciousness, clawing for life, sinking deeper and deeper into the waters. That panic, that descent into darkness. That's what the first stage of the move towards apotheosis becomes. The second stage is the albedo, or leucosis in Greek, which is associated with water in the West. Albedo means whitening, so washing away the burnt bits to reveal what is underneath. And as far as Jung was concerned, this is the period in which the hero, the male hero, descends into the underworld to encounter his anima, the feminine aspect of his own soul, his own psyche, his own consciousness, which in mythology is often expressed in the image of a wife or a girlfriend, a beloved woman, that he's got to go into the underworld and rescue her from captivity by the forces of darkness. And there are, of course, although he didn't give as much attention to female psychology, at the time he was writing, things were much more male-dominated then than they are now. Feminist Jungians have filled in the gaps that Jung didn't address very clearly, and spoke about myths where the central character is a woman, like the descent of Inanna. So it's the woman that goes down to rescue her husband or a boyfriend, or sometimes it's another male relative, like a son, for example, but to rescue the animus, the male aspect of the woman's psyche. And again, Jung said that these kind of stories can play out with actual human beings, where there is an attempt to rescue someone from illness or addiction, or being stuck in a violent relationship, or whatever it may be. There is a rescue going on with an actual human being. But deeper down, more crucially, is understanding that the woman in question, or the man in question, is actually part of you, is symbolic of a part of you, shall we say. And so in the myths and stories, the hero and the heroine, or the hero and the damsel in distress, or whatever, the version of a male damsel would be a swain in distress. They are part of the psyche, just as the monster is part of the psyche of the same being. These are all different aspects of the same being encountering each other. Jung was, having given you those three stories of Antinous to Hare as well, what these days we would class as gay love stories, although the word gay obviously wasn't used at that period of history. Jung was quite, well, for a man of his historical time, fairly okay with the idea of gay people, in as much as he said, well, as long as they're happy, let them get on with it, kind of thing. He wasn't massively pro, but then again, he was not massively anti either. He was fairly neutral. And there have been Jungian psychologists since, in the decade since Jung's death, who have asked themselves, how do these stories play out? We're understanding stories of a male hero rescuing a woman, or a female heroine rescuing a man. What if someone is gay? Will you have stories of a man rescuing another man, or a woman rescuing another woman? So what happens if it's someone whose main romantic interest is their own sex rather than the opposite sex? And that's a subject of ongoing discussion. I can't offer you any nice clear-cut answers on that one. But whether you understand it as rescuing the inner man, the inner woman, or rescuing a romantic ideal. So for a gay person, that romantic ideal could be an image of another man, or an image of another woman, rather than an image of the person of the other sex. Nonetheless, the concept of the conscious mind rescuing part of the unconscious mind, that's the same thing, regardless of the gender kind of setup involved in that. So the sense of going into the underworld to rescue the loved one, no matter what the sex of the loved one happens to be. And there's lots of myths about that idea of a descent to rescue. This is finding the part of you that is undeveloped, that you love, you adore, you treasure, because you see the value in it, even if you are not fully developing it in your conscious mind yet. The yellow phase, the citrinitas, or zymphosis in Greek, is associated with air. And there's a slight variation here. I'll give you Jung's version before briefly mentioning the interpretation. Jung's version that this was a period of dawn, the yellow light of the sun in early dawn as it descends from the darkness of midnight through the sky. It comes out with the dawn there. So if you've, like me, you go to watch the dawn on midsummer solstice and you see it emerge from the darkness of the night as it comes out. That's the yellow stage, the golden light stretching its arms across the land. The beginning, the dawning was then the start, and the force encountered, the archetype encountered for Jung was principally the, if we want to be gender neutral, the sage, the wise woman or the wise man. And usually, as Jung said, the sex of the figure will be the same as the person. So a man will have a wise old man, and a woman will have a wise old woman, or a wizard or a witch, a kind of an image of McGonagall or Dumbledore, as it were, this kind of sage, wise figure that exists within us, which he related to the Greek concept of the Gartha daemon. So just as the Kakadaemon keeps track of all your awful deeds and your worst impulses, so the Agartha demon is more like the Catholic notion of the Holy Guardian Angel. It's this benevolent presence that encourages you to goodness and wisdom and kindness, and pushes you down that path and steers you. That kind of higher consciousness, that inner morality, that wants you to be a better person than you have been in the past. And one of the issues here for Jung was that, going back to the phase of Nigreda, there is the conflict between the light and the dark, the day and the night, the living and the dead, the good figure and the evil figure, as they go at each other's throats, neither of them realising that the other is part of themselves, that we are all capable of both light and dark. And in a sense, although warfare is a bit of a dramatic terminology, between the anima animus and your conscious self, there's not warfare, but there is a lack of awareness that these two forces are actually two sides of a single coin. And so both with the shadow and with the inner man or inner woman, there is a movement from regarding these as two opposing poles to gradual awareness, and that's the Citrinitas phase, a gradual awareness that these are actually two sides of one coin. They are not different beings, they are not opposing beings, they are two aspects of one much larger being, which is larger than the male or female, larger than the light or dark, because it's both. And there's that process of bringing together, and so when you realise that the wise old man or the wise old woman is not some very clever person out there, although again, Jung said often it manifests as an actual person in life, a teacher, a mentor, a guide, a grandparent, some nice old uncle or auntie who is a guardian figure for them, and you can relate to them, an actual human being, as a canvas on which to project your own inequalities. When you reach the point of realising that those inequalities are exactly that, they are you, they are not something out there, they're something in here, that's the beginning of wisdom. That's the start of the civil war or the conflict or the blind spot or whatever you want to call it, resolving itself when you come to the realisation of unity. James Hillman suggested that it wasn't, the Citrinitas stage was not the encountering with the inner wise figure, but actually everyone has both a male side and a female side. So at Albedo you encounter one, and at Citrinitas you encounter the other. So if you're a man, you encounter your inner woman at Albedo, and at Citrinitas you encounter your outer man, which you will probably understand as a source of wisdom, and hence the wise old man idea. So it's not a total contradiction to Jung, but it is a slight different take on it. There was a Russian Orthodox priest, Sergius Bulgakov, who nearly got himself up on charges of heresy when he suggested that in the Christian tradition you have the Father, the Son and the Holy Ghost, the three big aspects, and a lot of theological traditions, not only the Christian one but many other theological traditions as well, put a huge emphasis on the three. The image of central to Egyptian story of Osiris, Isis and Horus, or Azza, Azet and Haru, whatever names you want to know them by, mother, father, child, which is also something you can find similar examples of in mythologies from other parts of the world as well. The big focus on the three, Bulgakov felt, was losing sight of the fourth and leading to imbalance. And so, although he didn't quite put it in Jungian terms, he put it in very Christian terms, for Bulgakov, that fourth element that balances out the Father, the Son and the Holy Ghost was Sophia, the feminine spirit of wisdom. What the Irish used to be a Catholic priest before he became a liberal Catholic priest, which is a different organisation, kind of a breakaway movement from the Catholic Church. Dara Malloy talks about this huge imbalance in traditional Catholicism because it has Father, Son and Holy Ghost. It doesn't have a divine mother. Although he says, well, actually it kind of does Mary and the feminine presence, like the notion of Sophia as a feminine presence. The presence of wisdom, there is one there, but it gets desexualized. And that's, for Dara Malloy, is the problem, that this kind of virginal, asexual feminine figure doesn't fully fill the gap. You need a figure that is very definitely wife and mother, that has a sensuality, a sexuality, a fully rounded femininity, rather than just being this kind of muted, asexual figure that has a chunk of it taken away. And I know that's branching off into Christianity, but you could make an argument potentially that whilst ancient paganisms and the various versions of the ancient past were very, very erotic and sexualized and sensual and very much in tune with the physical and the natural and so forth, the modern day paganism sometimes, not always obviously, but sometimes tends to, shall we say, sweep things under the carpet a little. The number of artistic renditions I've seen of Pan in which he has no genitals, so unlike those ancient statues where you're getting an eyeful, that you get a lot of modern day artistic painting representations of Pan and statues of Pan in which he's like a kind of pretty boy from a boy band, very simpering and pretty and robbed of his sexuality, robbed of his animalistic element. It's a neutering done, I suspect, to make things more palatable to a mainstream crowd. But again, it's very different from what Bulgakov was talking about, but it's that wish to hide something that is unpalatable for some reason, and it misses something, it really does. And so it's important for Jung to have an acknowledgement of 4 stages and not ditch the 3rd stage of Saturnitis and just focus on the other 3. That is leading to a mistake from a Jungian point of view. The final stage, rubedo, or aiosis, the reddening. The sun rises higher into the sky and its fiery light goes from the golden arms of dawn into the fiery light of noon, is apotheosis, is becoming divine, is recognising your inner divine spark, not just as a nice idea on paper, but as a lived reality, a passionate transformative experience of that inner blazing fire. And so you step forth, and you step forth into a state which Jung referred to as syzygy. Syzygy is when all of those opposite factors, the light and the dark, the male and the female, the wise and the foolish, when all of those factors come together and are united in one. And you, your sense of self, which is not your ego, so at the moment what's talking to you is my ego, that's trying to come up with the appropriate words and is very conscious-minded, if you like. That's a mask, it's a front, it's a useful tool in survival, but it's not ultimately the real me. Just as your ego is not ultimately the real you. There is that divine core, that spark, what the Romans referred to as the genius in men and the uno in women, that inner divine essence, which is fired by the process of spiritual awakening. It's where we're leading to, from a state in which we barely understand ourselves at all, to a state in which we fully understand ourselves. We have this process of awareness and awakening and reasoning, which doesn't mean you suddenly get amazing magic powers and lightning bolts shoot out your fingertips, but you become aware of your own eternal self. And we can argue that that's something that most religions are encouraging to some extent. Not only the pagan ones, but Christianity is encouraging, Islam is encouraging, Judaism is encouraging, Sikhism is encouraging, Hinduism is encouraging an awareness of that divinity. But it has to be contextualized, and this is the important thing, alongside everybody else's divinity as well. So it's not a case of going, I am God, bow down and worship me, kiss my boots, because that's egomania. It's rather saying, I am a divine spark in human flesh, and so are you, and so are you, and so are you. So we are not, I am not the sun radiating light at the centre of the universe. I am a star in a constellation of a million other stars, and we are all radiating light together. And of course, if you want to go much more down the animist route, which is where I find myself more often than not, then it's not only humans that have that divine spark. All living beings, bearing in mind the notion of what constitutes a living being for an animist is much broader than for a biologist. All living beings have the divine spark in them, that capacity. And so we have a universe with so many stars, it's like grains of sand on the beach. It's phenomenal. So for Jung, this is something you can achieve in life rather than actually being dead, as in the stories of Tu Shan and Tinnitus and so on. But those stories of how they become this divine light being, you can understand as going through these processes to attain that sense of divinity. And one thing I want to show you, a visual image, having spoken about earth, air, fire and water in the directions, the circle, which I'm sure probably every single person watching this will be familiar with, if we put that into the quartered circle, you begin in the north, in darkness. You move to water, to the whitening, from the darkening to the whitening, then from the whitening to the yellowing, to the citrinitus, and from there to the rubedo, to the reddening, the fiery state. And if you transpose that onto a circle as you got on the slide there, what you end up with is that S-like shape, which heathens or simply people with an interest in runes will recognise. The sun rune, the rune of fulfilment, of joy, of awakening, of success, of glowing bright and brilliant. And those of you with an interest in Pictish art and Celtic imagery will understand and recognise from various an image even carved into various standing stones, chiefly in Scotland, of the lightning flash. And often that lightning flash is seen as crossing over, as per the image on the slide there, a kind of image of two spheres linked by a bridge. Now I've got no idea, nobody does, exactly how the ancient Picts understood that. But I'll give you a Jungian spin on it, which is a very modern day spin, and I went for 1 minute suggesting that this is what the ancient Picts thought. The two spheres are the light and the dark, the male and the female, the wise and the foolish, all of the various dualities and oppositions we have within our consciousness, linked by a bridge. Just as in our brain the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere is linked by the corpus callosum. And the lightning flash of awakening through those 4 stages cuts through the duality and brings unity, resolves 2 into 1, resolves two hemispheres into one brain, resolves a split self into a unified self. Not that we turn into one big blob or blur, but that we become aware that we are not 500 beings in contradiction to each other. We are 500 beings working together. We are a whole, we are a community, we are a gestalt of these different forces. They are all us. We are all there. Anelia Jaffe, who was a student of Jung, she wrote lots of books and so forth of her own, described this process towards apotheosis as a preparation for death. So that, as per the myths, where their apotheosis of Tila Shen and the other figures is primarily achieved after death. So even though you can aim to engage in these processes of awakening in life, a true benefit from them will come when we are dead and our soul goes on to what is yet to come. We are preparing for the final step. Joseph Campbell had a slightly different take. He described, when he was talking about the monomyth, his idea that there was this underlying story to be found in a million cultures around the world, the hero with 1,000 faces, that the hero goes through a series of steps in these myths. He said there were 17 altogether. And for him, the process of apotheosis is stage number 10 in that journey, as opposed to the final stage. So a slight different take. There is a criticism made of him, John Barry Tolkien, who was another passionate student of mythology and ballads and music and folk tales and things like that, which anyone who is musically inclined and likes your folk songs, you might be already aware of. He said it's that Campbell was making a bit of a naive mistake in assuming that there was one universal story. The phrase or the word polymyth is something I made up and chucked on there. It's not a word from John Barry Tolkien. It's my suggestion. I mean, if you like a monomyth and it works for you and it floats your boat, great, go for it. But I think that is a product of monotheist thinking, that there is one answer to all things. Personally, I'm a polytheist. I think there are many stories that crop up. So not just one story repeated a million times over, but maybe 10,000 stories, each repeated a million times over, that crop up around the world, because not everyone has the same experiences. And so just as feminist Jungians were arguing that the journey to spiritual awakening for a woman might be different from the journey for a man, you could argue maybe, as per those three homoerotic, or whatever you want to call them, deities mentioned at the start, is it the same for straight people, gay people, the same for Chinese people, Asian people, African people, Russian people, Spanish people? I don't know. And I'm not for 1 minute going to suggest one way or the other. But I do think there are many stories, just as there are many souls, and that's only thinking about humans. What is the story of spiritual awakening for the soul of a dog, or of an elephant, or of a parakeet? I have no idea, and I wouldn't assume that they have the same soul journey, the same story that I do. So I'm open to the idea that there are polymyths rather than a monomyth. Many stories, and I've given you an example of some, but not necessarily all. Is this a nice, easy journey? Obviously not. The descent into hell, the harrowing, is in no sense easy. We all know that. If any of you have been through shitty, awful, terrible dark nights of the soul, and I'm sure many of you have, you will know it's never easy. And when grief rips your heart apart, or rage, or bitterness, or any other number of other quite harsh emotions. Jung said there are pitfalls along this journey. There are problems that can be encountered. So just as the Egyptian underworld, the Duat, was described as having a long old journey for the soul through many gateways and doors of monsters and these underworld figures, which could destroy a soul before they attain the halls of Amenti and the ultimate judgment. So there are traps in the journey of the living, not just in the journey of the dead, where we can go astray. And one of those traps, Jung said, is inflation, which is nothing to do with economics and monetary problems. Inflation is where you start to mistake an archetype for your soul, for your spirit. So those kind of delusional, dodgy gurus which set up a cult and claim to be the living god or the living goddess, and then usually get found out to have shagged 3 dozen of their followers and fiddled the finances and drive around in a fleet of Rolls Royces and all the rest of it. They are people who have, perhaps at the beginning of their journey, gone in search of this divine spark, but come to think of themselves as some incarnate deity, rather than one star in a constellation of millions of stars. They come to think of themselves as the end-all and be-all, and that other people have to worship them. Which may be something that some of those Roman emperors and Egyptian pharaohs also suffered from, that kind of raging egomania. Inflation is a bit like sticking your fingers in a plug socket and getting overwhelmed by energy. It's when you communicate with an archetype so intense and your capacity to regulate is so weak that it overwhelms you, and you come to think that you are the archetype, rather than just someone who partakes a little bit of an archetype. You come to think it is you, it defines the whole of you, and it doesn't. And that's a danger, that you can become overwhelmed by these cosmic notions to think that you are something other than what you actually are. Some of these ancient figures can be understood in a Jungian context as representative of particular archetypes. So Ethan Doyle White writes about the idea that Antinous can be understood as the pure Eternus, the eternal child, the eternal youth. He died when he was 19 or 20, terribly pretty. He didn't grow old and fat and wrinkly and bald like the rest of us. he died eternally beautiful and young. And you can see that in the Hollywood figures, for example, of stars who have died very young and not grown old and ragged and awful looking, and so their fame rests, that sort of James Dean, Marilyn Monroe, it rests in no small part on the fact that they died young and are now eternally young and beautiful in the pseudo-heavenly realms of celluloid. So Antinous you can understand as a god in his own right, or you can see him as an example of an archetype of a pure Eternus, which is an issue that I struggle with. Although I'm a great fan of Jung, I think any one of us can be understood temporarily as taking part of an archetype, but we are always more than an archetype. More than any one single archetype, we just kind of dip in and out of them. And if that's true of the living, it's true of the dead and of the divine as well. So Antinous may be like the pure Eternus, the eternal child, but he's more than it. He may dip in and out of it, but he is more than it. And I think that's true of all of the gods. They are more than the sum of their archetypes, just as we are more than the sum of our stereotypes, if you like. What is not clear to me is how apotheosis actually works in the religious sphere. So I'm not talking about the Jungian sphere of personal inner awakening, but those gods who were once human. I struggle because I mentioned all these dodgy gurus. I've seen too many lunatics claiming to be godlike over the centuries and seen the misery they cause, which makes me very wary of wanting to worship somebody who once upon a time was flesh and blood and walking the earth, which is probably a weakness on my part rather than anything else, that I need to see beyond those problems. But is what makes Tu Shen, and he is a god that fascinates me. I can't claim to have had any burning shrubbery type experiences of the voices of Tu Shen booming at me from out of the collective unconscious, but he fascinates me, and I keep coming back to him in stories and dreams and poems. He's sort of hovering there, trying to say something, and I'm just too thick to understand what. Did he become a god? Did Hu Chan Bao become the little rabbit god? Because the august Jade Emperor made him so? Or because a bunch of people, farmers, whoever they were, had dreams in Fujian province and told their dreams, and those dreams were believed? So in other words, is it humanity that attributes divine status to some dead person, whereupon practically anyone, if you follow that logic, could have divine status attributed to them, just as we treat some Hollywood starlets as if they are gods, and sometimes royalty as if they were infallible deities who must be listened to at all costs, which is seldom a wise thing to do, at least not while they're alive, you know. Is this a process conferred by humanity, and so a little bit random, or is this a process that has to be confirmed by pre-existing deity? And so it is the gods that make other gods, or is it humans that make gods? And I just don't know. So I have no answers for you on that one. It's something for, you may have your own answers already, but if you don't, it's something you might want to think about and see what kind of insights you come to. What I do think is, having gone down the analyst line a bit already, is that this is not something confined to humans. We know from practices of the ancient Egyptians and many other parts of the world the tendency to recognise the divine in animal form. And that's something I can very easily go along with. Again, a flaw on my part, I'm sure. But I can see a stag running past on the moorland and see Kanunos in that stag. I can see the divine in that stag. I have no problems doing that at all. When I'm sitting on a park bench in the town centre watching humanity shamble past, dragging its knuckles, I find it very hard to see anything divine in 99.9% of the people who walk past, including my own reflection in the mirror. I think there's so much divine in that either. And that, I think, is a short-sightedness on my part, that I can recognise the divine in the non-human, but I struggle to recognise it in the human. But my own hang-ups aside, I think it's not just human beings who can attain, in the Jungian sense, this apotheosis, this awakening of the soul. I think other beings do that as well. And so we can encounter other beings, sometimes maybe in the flesh, and sometimes beings who have shuffled off their mortal coil and gone wherever, who have attained to become something far greater than they were in life. They've become awakened in some capacity. Whether we think of them a bit like the Buddhists do, as a bodhisattva, an entity that comes to help the living and guide us, guide humans, and also guide other beings. I don't think it's just humans that have these encounters. I think other creatures have encounters with entities that they understand as well, to guide people to better lives. Do I understand the apotheosized as full-on 100% gods, or as something more like saints or demigods, a kind of halfway house? Not 100% mortal, well, definitely not mortal anymore, but not 100% human and not 100% divine, but something in the middle. At the moment, that's where I'm seeing it, more in that kind of intermediary status. So like the way in which in Sweden some ancestors were seen as attaining to alpha state. They became elves, they became something that would be present in the burial mounds on the family farms, containing who knows how many generations of the same bloodline, who would watch over their descendants and guide them and guard them. So there were, if you like, ordinary ancestors, but there were also these extra special ones who had become something more than the human beings they once were. They'd become something additional. And that's, at the moment, these things are a learning process. We change our minds as we gain new experiences. At the moment, where I see the apotheosized. So even though I struggle, and as much as I'm aware of the stories and I find great beauty in them, I do struggle to understand quite what the hell it is I'm doing in ritual. when I try to communicate with some of those beings. The full-on gods, I'm okay with that idea. It's the apotheosized. I'm trying to think, what the hell am I doing? But an experience to keep working with and gain from. And it would be a shame we're not meeting in person, because it would be fascinating to hear other people, those of you listening to this, to hear your experiences of the divine, the magical, wondrous, how you understand it and how you engage with it. And I realise I've gone way over time, so I will stop talking. If you do have any questions, you can always email them to me, or feedback, comments, drives to share. I'd be fascinated to hear. But thanks for listening, and please do remember to chuck some money towards our worthy causes for this year's Leaping Hare. Here's to seeing you in 2021.